Hi, this is Bonnie. I'm back with block 10 of our Block of the Month Club. It's a couple days late because I actually took a vacation and went to Vermont to see my grandchildren, which I hadn't been able to do in a very long time because of COVID. So this video is a couple days late, but I still hope you enjoy it. This month, we are going to be doing a quilt block called Providence. And you see that it is supposed to be like a meeting hall or a meeting that you would have had, say, in New England when the colonies were first getting started, and people would form a town meeting and discuss the issues and make their laws. Now, this block has many little pieces. I can't stress enough how important it is to cut your pieces accurately as you are cutting out. You sew your seams accurately. The smaller the pieces, the more the pieces, the more likely your block is to pucker and not lay flat when you go to iron it. You're going to have to press more often with this block. If you don't, then you don't get the correct stretch to make the blocks fit together correctly. So we're going to get started with just a few little reminders. On the website, you're going to find the pattern, and it's called Providence Quilt Block. And if you go to the very end of the posting, it's going to give you an address where you can go in and directly print this whole set of directions, or you simply, once you get on this web page, you could copy and paste it to a Word document, an empty Word document page in whatever you have, Windows 10, if you have Libra, which the library has, or if you have a different Word program on your computer, you can paste it to a blank page and copy it that way. The directions, as I have mentioned before, are wonderfully given. They explain everything from what size to cut your pieces to how to start to sew your pieces together, and then how to assemble your pieces. And some of the patterns even give you a design of what it would look if you did an entire quilt with this quilt block. Now remember, we're only doing one block at a time, a different block each month. I am doing 3 different blocks because I want a king-size quilt when I'm done. And also that gives me the opportunity to show you the block in pieces so that you understand how it will be assembled. So for the first thing they're going to tell you to do, they're going to tell you to cut 2.5-inch blocks, which is this size of block. And then on your background block, you're going to make a diagonal line, just the line. You aren't going to cut it at this time. This is going to be your guideline for when you do your stitching. You're also going to need just plain squares. And then you're going to need, and follow your directions carefully, you're going to need some 3-inch blocks, and you're going to need some 3.5-inch blocks. So let's get started. You're going to need to make a square, oh my gosh, I can't think of the name, half square, half squares. So half square triangles, that's what you're going to make. So using a neutral color thread, remember I mentioned before how I like the neutral color threads. They blend with the darks and the lights, but they don't stand out too much between each other. So I'm going to take the block that I have done my line on, And I'm going to do the background color face to face with whatever my first color is. These are 2.5-inch blocks. Then using a guideline, using this line as your guideline, you're going to run your presser foot right along that guideline. A presser foot is 1/4 inch on each side. So when you run your presser, the edge of your presser foot along this line, it's going to give you 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you'll flip it over and you'll do the same thing on the other side. So when you're finished, you will have, I can use this one, you're going to have your center line with stitching 1/4 inch from the center line in both directions. Once you have finished your square triangle, you've finished that stitching, then you're going to use that solid line as your cutting line. That's going to give you 2 of the half square triangles. Once you've done this, be sure and press your seam over nice and flat. Pressing is so important. I have just a small quilting iron, and then I keep just a ironing pad and just on a little table beside my sewing machine. And that way I can just sew and move over here and press real quick and then get ready to keep sewing. The one thing that I haven't talked about before, and again, it is so important when you're working with the smaller pieces, you're going to want to square up this square. You're going to want to make sure that this is just a true 2.5 inches. So let me move the camera down, and I have my stitching all done. I have it pressed flat. So now I'm going to flip it over, and on my small ruler, you see that I have a diagonal line that goes across my ruler. I'm going to line that diagonal line up with my half square triangle square. And as I see, if I line up the edges, I have just a little extra fabric right along that block. So what I'm going to want to do, I want to get rid of that, because even that little tiny bit of extra fabric is going to throw your design off. So let me trim this off. And this is called squaring up your piece. And now I have, if I put my little 2.5 inch square on here, it is perfect all the way around. And I know that when I go to sew them together, I'm going to be able to get nice even blocks, and one won't be a little too large and the other too small. So that's very important. So this will be the first thing that you're going to do. And I believe there are 8. There's 8 of these half square triangles that you're going to make. The next thing you're going to make are your hourglass shapes. Now, this one at first maybe looks a little daunting, but it's really very simple. So you're going to take your 3.5 inch squares. I have a background fabric, and then I have the fabric that's going to be my solid color in my quilt block. Again, I ran a solid line down from corner to corner. You see I did the same on both sides. And that's going to be my line, my guideline. Now I'm going to run another line corner to corner, and that line you're going to use in a minute. So you're going to take this center guideline, sew 1/4 inch on each side. And once you have that done, then you're going to take your scissors and you're going to cut along that stitching line. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Don't panic, you're supposed to cut it in 2. So now I have 2 triangles. that when I open it up, I have a half square triangle. Now, again, I would go to my iron and I would iron this seam nice and flat. I iron it both on the front and the back and with a steam iron, and the steam causes the threads in the fabric to soften enough that you can pull it over, and then you're going to have this very nice flat seam. What you're going to find with your half square triangles, when you get them sewn and you get them pressed, you're going to have this little tail sticking out. And you want to go ahead and trim that little tail off, even with the block. You want to get rid of all that extra fabric. It doesn't seem like it would make that much difference, but it really does when you go to join your blocks together. And you want nice flat seams that are going to press nice and flat. So the more extra fabric you can get away from there, the better. Now look how much better that looks, just getting those little corners trimmed off. Then again, this is a 3.5 inch square. I'm going to square it up with my ruler. I'm going to make sure, now here's my 3.5 inch ruler, and it also has a diagonal line printed on it. And I'm going to run that diagonal line down the seam line. And excuse me, it starts out 3.5, but it ends up 3. Excuse me, I misspoke there. So I'm going to put my ruler on. And here we have, it's lined up nice and even here, nice and even here. Here, but this side, there's a little too much fabric. So I'm going to take my ruler, I'm going to spin it around, and now I've got my 3, I'm sorry, you have to work backwards to what it actually is. So I laid my 3 inch line along the block here, but look over here, I have extra fabric over on this side. So again, I've got that diagonal line on there. I'm going to put a mark, and I'm going to cut that little bit of extra off. And then I know that I have a nice even 3 inch block. The more accurate you measure, the more you press, the easier it's going to be to assemble this or any quilt block. So now I have a perfect 3 inch square. Started out with a 3.5 inch square. By the time I took the seams out of the middle 1/4 inch, then you see that now I have a perfect 3 inch square. So there's 1/2 of the 3 inch square. And let's do the same thing with the second half of the 3 inch square. So I had cut it in 2. I'm just finger pressing right now because I don't have time, or I don't have the iron right here. I have it nice and flat. I'm going to cut those little tails off, get that extra fabric out of the middle. That's going to cause problems when I go to put my pieces together. So now I have, a second, I have a pop-up I've got to get rid of. So now I have my 2 3 inch squares. I'm going to take my ruler. I'm going to line the ruler up to make sure that this is even. 3 inch, 3 inch. This one I also have a little extra. So let's get rid of that extra. Get that cut off. Nice sharp scissors, small scissors work very well. Okay, so now I have 2 3 inch squares. Remember, I am now making, I have my half square triangle squares, and now I'm going to make the hourglass shape. So let me do this. I've got all kinds of weird messages popping up. I'm sorry. So now I have my 3-inch squares. Now, to make the hourglass, you take one of your 3-inch squares, you spin it around. You spin it around so that you line up your color against background, color against background. So you spin it around and then you line up those seams and you put a pin in to hold it. Now, remember when I had you at the very beginning, I had you do that second line, diagonal line? That's the reason, because now to make this hourglass, you've got these all lined up, and because I pressed them, the seam allowance is on opposite sides of that center line, so it's going to lay nice and flat. Now, using the second diagonal line that I drew it both on the background and on the colored fabric. Now I'm going to use this line as my guideline. I'm going to run my presser foot right along that guideline, and I'm going to make 1/4 inch on this side, seam allowance, and 1/4 inch on the other side. So this one gets like a double sew. So when you're finished, you're going to have this look. You have a color and background, a color and background, but because you spun them before you sewed them, you've got them all lined up, so they're going to be opposite. So here are my 2 seam allowances. Now I'm going to use that guideline that goes down the middle as my second cutting line. So now I'm going to cut along there. And now I'm going to open this up, and I have a beautiful hourglass block. Now here's my seam. So again, I'm going to press. I have 2 seams pressed in one direction. This one will be pressed right down over the top of the other 2. So it's going to lay nice and flat when you have it all ready. So there's 1/4 inch, and here's another 1/4 inch. And these are called hourglass shapes. And you're going to need, if you follow your instructions, you're going to need 4 of those. So that's just a little helpful hint on how to do the hourglass. You're going to start with your 3.5 inch square. You're going to put a line down the center. Then you're going to stitch 1/4 inch on each side of that line. Use the center line as a cutting line. Open it up and press your seams back. I usually press light onto dark on both halves. So here's going to be the second one, light onto dark. And then I'm going to spin, and I'm going to put, again, it's backwards on the screen, and I'm going to put these together. So the dark is lined up with the light on this side, the dark is lined up with the light on this side. So when I put them down, it's going to be, and because I pressed them light to dark, I'm not going to have a bulky seam. They're going to lay really flat. I'm going to line those up, and I would pin these just with straight pins just to make sure that they're going to stay in place. Then that second line that I drew all the way across, that's now going to become the stitch or the guideline for the second time you're going to stitch this. 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, and then use your center line to cut down. And then when you open them up, you will have an hourglass shaped piece. Very simple to do. Again, you're going to take and lay this flat because you want this to be a 2.5 inch block. And I see if I lay them down, I've got to get rid of those tails. I have a little bit too much on this side. So again, and it's not unusual when you're doing this many flips and this many cuts that your squares get off a little. And that's why you need just to square them up. So when you go to sew those pieces together, they're going to line up and make nice connection points where the pieces come together. So I squared that one up. And now I want to take this one, open it up, lay the seams nice and flat, and press them. Press before you, oh, this one's really off. I don't know why it is, but it is. So let's get this one. And sometimes what happens, the fabric stretches. And so you end up with your pieces being just a little off because the fabric has actually stretched as you've been working with it. So there you go, all trimmed up and ready to go. So once you have completed all of your little blocks, you're going to have some blocks that are going to stay plain, 2.5 inch squares. You're going to have some half square triangles that started out as 3 inch, and then when you're finished with them, they're also 2.5. So they're going to be the same size as these squares. And then you're going to have your hourglass. So those are the 3 shapes you're going to work with today: the hourglass, the half square triangle, and then the regular square block. Looking at the pattern, you're going to start putting your row together. So I noticed something. I actually cut these blocks while I was on vacation. So I cut all 3 blocks at the same time with different color combinations for my 3 different blocks that I'm doing. And wouldn't you know, in the process of getting everything home, all my little blocks got mixed together. So I got busy and I was sewing, and I had it all sewn together. And then after it was sewn and after it was pressed, and this happened, I think, when they all got mixed together, look what I did. Instead of putting a dark one to follow the pattern here, I ended up putting a light one there, which I will change out. But this one is actually assembled in 5 different rows. And then you're going to lay your pattern out to make sure you have all of your points in the correct direction before you start to sew your rows together. Now, this second one is completely different colors than the first one. And it makes a huge difference in how the block looks. It looks like an entirely different block, when actually all you've done is switch the colors out. So once I have all my little rows, and I have found this helps so much if I tape the rows down to this ruler sheet, or if you tape it down to something, then you don't get mixed up. When you put your little strips together, you don't get them flipped and in the wrong direction. Look how that would just throw the whole quilt block off. So I lay them all out, I tape them down. I know it sounds funny, but I tape them down, and that way they aren't going to shift and they aren't going to rotate. So I'm going to just show you quickly. I will take off the first row, and I'm going to flip it to line up with the second row. And because of the way that I pressed it, my little seams are going to line right up. so that when I sew it together, it's going to be nice and flat, and it's going to be seam against seam, and that holds them in place. I also pin, but the seam against seam holds it in place so it doesn't slip when you're sewing it. And just sew together the first 2 rows, and then take those and continue adding the rows until your block is entirely assembled. Now this is a 10-inch block. So again, you're going to have to add your 1.5-inch border strips all the way around, so that, and this, I just picked up this piece of lace because it's the same size. It's 1/4 of an inch wide. And you'll put those all the way around. So when your quilt block is finished, it's going to be 12.5 inches. And that will make it, when it's in the quilt, when you put it in the quilt, a 12-inch block. And that's what we're aiming for all of our blocks, to be a true 12 inches. When it comes time to sew your blocks together, this is a 12-inch square. Now remember, on my quilt block, I have not put that extra border around it. This is just the 10-inch square done. When I have this completed, this is a 12-inch block, and so I could lay this right on my quilt block, and I'll have like a 1/4 of an inch sticking out all the way around. But you're going to want to make sure that these blocks are true also before you put them in your quilt, or again, you're going to have trouble with your quilt block puckering when you go to sew it together. So this is a little more difficult one. There's more steps. The hourglass block, if that's something you haven't done before, you might want to practice with some scrap fabric first. But it's really very simple to do, and if you follow the guidelines that are in here. Also, as you're working with these directions, if you need a little reminder, there's a web address that you can click on, and it will give you the directions again how to do your half square triangles. There's a web address. You click on it, it will show you again how to do your hourglass. So there's always help. Remember that I work all day Tuesday, Friday evening, and Saturday. If you need some help, just bring your piece on in. We have 2 more blocks to do before we're ready to assemble the quilt. Then once I have mine completed, I'm going to hang it down at the library so you can see how mine came out. And I would love it if you finish yours, even if you just get the top piece together, if you would bring it down to the library, and we will hang it, and we'll put them all in the meeting room and see what lovely quilts people have put together. I will tell you more about that as the time gets closer, but just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, that at some point it would be lovely to have your quilt top hanging down at the library. So I will see you next month, and it will be on time next month. Unfortunately, I can't go back to Vermont. I'm here for a while. So enjoy, have fun. Go ahead and come into the library, give me a call, and I'll try and help you through any problems you might have. And I would just love to see what you're doing. So take care, and I'll see you next month.